Hey nerdy knitters, in this video we're looking at the fisherman's rib pattern. We'll look at the chart for knitting flat and in the round and the written instructions and work a row or two. We'll look at the pattern, we'll compare it to half-fisherman's rib, and I also have two ways you can bind off in pattern while still giving that rib texture some stretch, so stick around for that. If you want to jump to any point, use the timestamp links in the video description box down below. In today's video we're looking at fisherman's rib. It's a plush, stretchy fabric, and it's very similar to brioche. It has the same sort of thickness. If you look right there, you can see how thick this rib is. It's because we work knit one belows, and it creates this plush, stretchy, very nice fabric. It's reversible, so it would be great for cuffs, for hats, for scarves, because both sides look the same. Okay, let's look at the chart and the written instructions. You can see here we have to work a setup row. That's important because on the very next row we're working a knit one below stitch, and to work a knit one below stitch you have to have a stitch ready to work. So that setup row is very important. Then the actual pattern, it looks complicated but it's really not. It's the same thing for every row, it just looks different because of course a chart represents the front of our work. So all you're doing is you're purling a stitch, knit one below, purl, knit one below, purl, knit one below. It's basically a rib, but instead of knitting, you're knitting one below, and it creates that texture. And then at the end, we purl two. Then we turn our work, and we repeat that. We purl, knit one below, purl, knit one below, across, and then purl the final two stitches. So it's only a one row repeat. That's all you have to remember. Of course, if you were going to work a scarf or something where you wanted to balance the pattern, you would want to add another column of knits on the other side because our pattern isn't balanced. We have one purl stitch on this side and two purl stitches on this side. So we would make that adjustment for a scarf, especially something worked flat. But if you wanted to work this in the round, it's an even number of stitches again, but now it's a two row repeat. Each of these columns has to have that knit one below or purl one below to keep this really plush texture. So we still have our setup round, we have to knit around, and then on round two we knit one below and we purl one across the row. We've removed those edge stitches because we don't need them when we're working in the round. But then on round three, right here, we switch our pattern, and now that knit one below we knit, and that purl stitch from the previous row we purl one below, and we do that across the row, and then we go back and we repeat. So it looks a bit complicated, but it's not a hard pattern to work at all. All you have to do is know how to knit one below. So let's work a row of the pattern. I've just finished a right side row, and I'm on a wrong side row, but I'm working flat. So it's the same pattern either way. One more thing to note is you don't want to end or begin with a knit one below. If you work a knit one below right on the edge, here let me work a stitch and we can see. I'm going to knit one below right here. If this were on the edge, I'm working this stitch and taking it off. That stitch that didn't get worked, even here, it's kind of big. If it were worked on the edge, it would be really large and really obvious. So we don't like to work a knit one below right on the edge stitch. So our pattern is simple. We purl, knit one below, purl, and then a knit one below is simply look for the stitch on your needle, look for the stitch beneath that one. There's the legs of the stitch, it makes that V right there. We insert right between the legs of that stitch into the hole, wrap our yarn, pull it through. That is a knit one below. And that's what gives us that plush texture. It's very, very similar to brioche. It's sort of like a lazy brioche. If we were to work a brioche stitch, what we would do is create a yarn over and slip that stitch. And then on the next row, we would work that yarn over and that slipped stitch together. But instead of doing that, when we insert down here, we're sort of creating a slipped stitch. We're pulling that stitch up and elongating it, and at the same time the stitch above becomes that wrap, that yarn over. So the actual fabric is very similar to brioche. All right, stick around because I have another stitch pattern, the Half-Fisherman's rib, which is very similar, and we can look at both of them and see the comparison. Oh, I'm at the end, so I have purl 2. And that's all there is to working this pattern. And working those knit one belows on every row gives us this really thick texture. Now let's compare that to, this one is Half-Fisherman's rib. It takes this pattern, it's not quite, you can tell by looking, well, it's worked on a lighter yarn too, but it's not as plush, not as thick. And here's the chart for that. You can see why it's called Half-Fisherman's rib. Because instead of working those knit one belows on every single row, they're only worked every other row. So it's not quite as plush and textured. So if you're ever confused about the difference between those two patterns, that's the only thing that's different about them, is the number of knit one belows that are worked. Now let's say we were all done with our work and we were ready to bind off. We want to keep this stretch because it is a rib, so it's got a nice stretch to it without being too restricted. So if we worked a basic bind off, it would restrict that edge too much. Now on a bind off row, you don't have to do a knit one below. I'm going to do a normal knit stitch here and pull that stitch over. I'm going to stay in pattern, so I'm going to purl and knit following the pattern set here. But I want to make it a little more stretchy so it's not so restricted along that edge. I'll purl this next stitch, but I'm going to leave it on the needle while I pull this one over. And then pull it off. And doing that, leaving that stitch on the needle while you bind off, makes you pull up more yarn and makes this bind off row a little stretchier. So if you're finding that still not quite as much stretch as you'd like, because it does add some, but not a lot more, what you could do is work a yarn over. Working a yarn over, and then I bring this to the front so I can purl. And what I'll do is pull that yarn over and that stitch both over. That yarn over gives us a little more slack in our bind off row. It gives this stitch that we're binding off more space to stretch. So yarn over, work your next stitch in pattern. It's a purl stitch, so I'm purling, and then I'm pulling that yarn over and that previous stitch over the stitch on my needle. My next stitch is a knit stitch, so I yarn over and I knit, pull both of those over, just like that. And that gives it quite a lot more stretch. But what it also does is that yarn over, you can see the difference right here. It gives us 2 loops around each stitch, but it also creates these little holes underneath, which you can't really see unless you really stretch it apart and look. There, we pulled that last stitch through. You can see that bind off gives us lots of stretch along that edge. If you want to get a download of this stitch pattern, go to tanyaknits.com/library and follow the instructions on there to get that, and click subscribe down below if you would like to get nerdy with your knitting.